Welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of the Not Your Mama's Autism podcast. I'm Lola Dada Ali. In our last episode, we rounded out our segment on representation in film and media by speaking with Dominique Brown, an actor and musician best known for his work on the Netflix series Atypical. In this episode, we speak to a trailblazing attorney about her journey to the present day and some of what it took to get her there. I first heard of Haley Moss back in 2019 when I came across her story in USA Today. The headline read, "She may be Florida's first lawyer with autism, and she's out to change lives and minds." That appeared to be true then, and it's certainly true today. Haley is not only a lawyer, but an author, writer, podcast host, speaker, neurodiversity expert, disability rights advocate, and artist. She is the co-host of Spectrumly Speaking, a podcast dedicated to women on the spectrum. Along with her co-host, Dr. Lori Butts, a licensed psychologist and attorney in her own right, they discuss a range of topics and news stories, along with their own personal stories. Earlier this year, Haley published the book, Great Minds Think Differently: Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals. Her next book, The Young Autistic Adult's Independence Handbook, will be available in November 2021. She is also the author of the books Middle School, The Stuff Nobody Tells You About, and A Freshman Survival Guide for College Students with Autism Spectrum Disorders. The Stuff Nobody Tells You About. She's been featured in various publications, such as The Washington Post, Teen Vogue, HuffPost, and GQ, just to name a few. Like many of my guests on this podcast, she is a buster of stereotypes. This episode showcases the rich discussion I had with her that ran the gamut from her childhood to life today as an author and expert in her own right. So, with that in mind, let's get started. Today we have an amazing guest by the name of Haley Moss. She's a Renaissance woman. We are very happy to have her here today. Haley, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an absolute pleasure to get to join you today.
So let's start at the beginning, which I think is always good because people see the finish line, but I think sometimes it's good to peel back and just kind of see where the origin story. Where did you grow up and how would you describe your childhood?
I grew up in South Florida, so I'm from the Boca Raton, Parkland area. I grew up in Parkland, Florida. I've been in Florida my entire life, so even at this point, I'm currently out of Miami, and I am an only child. So I think that alone is pretty special because it means that all of the attention somehow goes to you. That people are always like, how did your parents balance other kids? I'm like, they didn't. So that's always the beginning of the origin stories. I was the only one. And I was diagnosed with autism in 1997. I was 3 years old. So it was a very different time. And I know before we even started talking today, we were talking about how much has changed since the 90s. And when I was diagnosed, I realized I was identified primarily because I was non-speaking, that at preschool, I was kind of a difficult kid. And I was a difficult kid even before that, but preschool is where it really began to show, is that I wasn't coloring inside the lines. I wasn't interacting with my peers. I was not drinking out of a cup the same way they were. I was also very anxious, especially like in different mommy and me programs with my mom is that I didn't want to be far from her. Even just the way that I would line up toys, or I would take like toy buses, because I was really into toy buses as a really little kid, and I would just sit there and spin the wheels. Is things like that that just seemed off, but they weren't sure why. And at the time, I was also completing these really large jigsaw puzzles. And it was very clear I knew how to read because I was able to follow along with different like books on TV and Dr. Seuss books and things like that. So my parents were originally expecting to hear I was some form of gifted. And when autism first came up, my parents were confused. They had never really had that experience of what autism is. My mom famously has told me she thought at first it was an auditory disorder because, you know, that AU sound, autism, auditory, it sounds very similar. And I'm like, yeah, if you don't know better, that makes a lot of sense. So my parents were initially told that they would be lucky if I made friends, if I eventually got a driver's license, if I graduated high school, if I made it into a minimum wage job. And that's what they were telling them when I was 3, which I think giving that kind of prognosis for any 3-year-old is absolutely ridiculous. So I guess we could just quickly do a fast forward. I was a very happy kid growing up, even though I was very quiet and I struggled making friends. I think my parents did a really great job making sure that I grew up happy and confident. And something I always like to point out, especially at this point in my life, is my parents were very neurodiversity affirming without knowing what neurodiversity was. So I think for a lot of parents who want to be allies to their kids, you don't have to have the vocabulary of social justice to do the right thing by your kids or by the people that you love. That you don't have to have that education that I know I spend a lot of my life at this point giving people in order to be someone who is supportive. So I'm extremely grateful that that's something my parents did really well, and they've always encouraged me every step of the way, and my mom is still my best friend.
That is awesome. Whether or not you are on the spectrum, neurodivergent of some other variety, or neurotypical, not a lot of people can say their moms are their best friend. So that is success in itself. I wanted to kind of expound upon, like, there's too many nuggets you dropped in a short amount of time. One is, it's interesting you said neurodiversity affirming and without maybe always knowing the vocabulary. That's a really important point because we talked a little bit before we started recording about people being afraid to have those tough conversations. And sometimes even having those tough conversations with their children, because especially if you're neurotypical, there's a big difference between advocates and self-advocates. And the advocates will get it wrong because even if we're close to the experience, we haven't lived it. And I think media reports state that your parents explained to you that you were autistic around age 9. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had the conversation when I was 9. And I think that when parents are trying to figure out, do I talk to my kids about disability? Do I talk to them about their own diagnoses? I think the answer is always yes. It's just, when does it feel appropriate and how do we do it in a way that our children are going to understand? I am not a parent. So please take all of my parenting advice with a grain of salt. This is just stuff that worked well in our family. Is at 9 years old, I was completely obsessed with the Harry Potter series. And my mom, one day over summer break, right before 4th grade, sits me down and tells me, like Harry Potter, that I have magical powers. And of course, being 9 years old and obsessed with Harry Potter, of course, I'm going to want to hear this out. And she explains to me how autism is different. And that it's not less or better nor worse, but it could be extraordinary. And a lot like Harry, I didn't fit in. Harry Potter did not fit in at home with the Muggles because he was seen as a freak who went to magic school and he was an orphan. He was just very different. But he didn't fit in at Hogwarts either because he was the boy who lives with a lightning bolt scar. He was a celebrity who didn't know he was a celebrity and didn't want to really be a celebrity. But either way, he was still the hero of the story. And kind of having that understanding resonated a lot with me because I didn't fit in necessarily. So I guess that was something that meant a lot to me. And we focused a lot on the strengths because all kids know the things that are hard for them. I didn't need someone to tell me you have a hard time relating to peers or making friends or making something like that happen. But I think that was something that really meant a lot, is having that conversation early on, and having it in a way that a nine-year-old me was able to relate to it and understand. And of course, as I got older, the conversations that we've had about autism evolved, and my knowledge expanded as I wanted to go out and find out as much information as I could, or if there were different books that my mom would recommend or that she had that I would read. I remember reading about autism for the very first time through the Babysitters Club series. And that was before I knew I was diagnosed, actually. And I didn't relate to it whatsoever because the character was non-speaking largely. She was described as a savant. She had these different skills to remember like dates on calendars and things like that. But there was something about the way that she was being treated and almost like bullied and taken advantage of by other kids was something that resonated. I wasn't a bullied kid, but seeing that kind of exclusion from being different kind of made sense to me. So I'm like, I was very confused at first. I'm like, autism is that thing that people don't talk. I didn't really know. I think for 9-year-olds, it's hard to explain that. But I think looking back, I would not have had that conversation any other way.
How would you describe your parents' approach to parenting as you grew up, just overall? How would you describe that?
I would describe my parents as very hands-on and very collaborative. So my parents are still married. My parents have been together for about 30 years now, I believe. They are very happy with each other, and they've always seen themselves as partners in what they did, including the different compromises they've made and the sacrifices they've made on behalf of the family and for me. So I think that's the best way that I would describe my parents. And my mom was extremely fortunate enough that she was able to stay home with me. And I realized that's a huge amount of privilege. And that's something my parents both decided on that was best for our family. And my mom also spent a lot of time learning how to do some of the different early intervention things herself. So my mom was very involved in play therapy and doing things with like floor time. Like once she saw how the practitioners would do it, she would practice doing it herself in a way that made sense to her. So we did a lot of DIR floor time type stuff when I was home. So we got to play with toys all the time. And of course, when I was young, I didn't think of any of this as therapy because adults playing with me was very normal in my world. I am an only child. I was used to being around a lot of adults. I've been used to being around adults since I was very little. I've been used to being around adults even when I was no longer receiving different services as a teenager and as even a young, like as a young adult my entire life. I think that was something I was used to anyway. So seeing play therapy didn't feel like therapy. I got to have fun. I got to play. Adults wanted to play with me, and I thought that was cool. Is I might have thought it was my parents' friends or somebody else. I just didn't know. I'm like, oh, cool. People want to play with me. So that I think made me very well adjusted and very happy. I didn't know that I was learning different skills through it. Now looking back, I'm like, aha, that's what you were doing. But I don't regret it whatsoever. But you realize like I was being tricked. You feel like it, like, oh my gosh, I was actually learning something while I was having fun, even playing different computer games. Like I remember playing the Jumpstart games when I was a kid. And of course they teach you things. Those are very much branded as educational things. But even when we were playing with different like action figures that I liked, or we were playing with different like dolls and other stuff too, because I liked a little bit of everything. Even when I play video games sometimes, it's like, oh my gosh, all of this is related. This is all teaching me stuff. And I never would have thought twice about it because young me was used to having people play with me, and I like to play games and I like to play with toys. So I think that made me very happy. And I think my parents were very creative, and in a lot of ways they were very ahead of their time with the approach that they took. I just would not change a thing about what they did. Like I feel very strongly about that. And I don't know if most autistic adults can say that, or most adults period can say that about their parents, but I don't think they really did anything wrong per se. It's like, there are things that might've been nice as like extra bonus features, but otherwise no complaints.
Just listening to how fervently and strongly you're able to advocate for yourself, it's interesting to note in your story that at the time of your diagnosis, you were nonverbal. So when did you start to speak? And can you walk us through some experiences of how you became more and more verbal over time?
I wish that I actually remembered being 3 and 4. And I think that's a really big ask of anybody. And somehow in autism world, that's always expected of me to be like, oh, do you remember being non-speaking? And I'm like, not really, because I was very young. I just remember crying a lot. I remember, and I've heard enough stories about how disruptive I was with all the crying sometimes, because it's kind of jarring if you're out in public and you don't know why this kid is crying all the time. And the parents aren't doing anything that looks incorrect necessarily, especially when you have someone who's like 3. But my parents did a lot of speech therapy with me and teaching me to speak was kind of the biggest goal that we had. I was saying words right before about pre-K 4, and I started off in special education. And at least for me, most of my early speech was very much just repeating things other people said. If you've spent time in autism world, you probably know this as echolalia. If you do not, it is repeating things you have heard from somebody else or you've seen on TV or in movies. We think of scripting, but like everything you say is scripting. It's like being a human parrot. That is the best description I can give you, but people don't think it's functional speech, and actually it is, because I didn't know how to say things on my own, really. And it wasn't until maybe about kindergarten or the first grade that I started being able to articulate my own thoughts and feelings and be able to really say things for myself that weren't just repeating things that I had already learned.
Thank you. I appreciate you continuing to educate me. I'm glad I put the disclaimer out there at the beginning. There's a difference between advocate and self-advocate, and you will get things wrong. And
that's okay, though, because I still get things wrong too.
Yeah, I hope you're not offended by that question.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think that when we talk about advocates and self-advocates, I think what's really important when people say that there are their kid's voice or something like that, we're advocating alongside people. We're not advocating as them or for them sometimes. We're helping amplify their voices. If somebody's non-speaking or they're not being taken seriously, whether it's because of gender or because of race or age or disability or any of these different factors, or even a combination of them, we're basically sometimes the microphone for that person, or we're the bridge, or we're able to help them get that message across because they might not be listened to, they might be silenced or unheard for whatever the reason. So I think I think that a lot of parents and advocates who say that they are advocating for someone really mean well. I think they don't realize a lot of times that they're really just helping lend their voice to help somebody else use theirs, or at least have their voice heard. So sometimes I know that my parents would do that for me, is if I wasn't being heard properly, or I didn't know how to tell another adult or person in my life that this is what's going on, they would be able to step in and kind of amplify that. So I think that's something that we all learn in advocacy. And I know that even from where I'm at now, is there are experiences I will never have, even as an autistic self-advocate. I will not know what it is like to be a man. I will not know what it's like to be transgender or non-binary. I do not know what it is like to be a different race. I do not know what it's like to be a different religion. I know what it is like to be me. So when people have those different experiences, it's up to me to know when to basically shut up and listen, and to be able to amplify those experiences. Say, hey, I don't have experience with marginalization based on this factor, but these people do, so you should listen to them. I think advocacy, no matter who you are, is also knowing when that your voice is not the most appropriate for that conversation.
Exactly.
And some people don't learn that. It's a tough balance, because you realize I could be insensitive or I could be very selfish about this, but also sometimes you have to know when you're not the right person.
Self-awareness is key, and it definitely, hopefully, grows for most of us over time.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully.
I think that's really something that's exciting when you look back, and if you've been in advocacy or even self-advocacy for a while, you realize some of the mistakes you've made as a younger person. And yes, they exist for all the world to see sometimes, especially if you've been like me and you've been in the public space for half of your life, at least at this point. And there are things that I've written when I was in college and things that I've written before I was in college that I realized, wow, this is kind of not great. This is kind of harmful, but I've learned from this. And I'm not going to go take it all down, because it's not that I'm not proud of it or something. It's more of like, hey, this is how I felt then, and this is a teachable thing that, see, we all can learn, and we all have made mistakes, because I think we get put on a pedestal at times as self-advocates as we know everything, when we also don't know everything. So when you're saying you're afraid of making a wrong statement or saying the wrong thing, like, oh no, please don't, because everybody does it. It's not just allies or neurotypicals. It's all of us who make mistakes, and we don't have all the answers either. And it's just being called in and learning, and when you know better, you do better.
Exactly. I just think humility and self-awareness is just very key in this space. And I thank you for teaching me, because you have a lens that I don't have, and vice versa. So
exactly. And I know I'm definitely going to learn from you today too. And I am appreciative of that. And I know that even before we got started, I was learning from you. So it's just really exciting. And I think that's what honestly, I think that's all you need to even get started in this conversation is just an open mind and an open heart.
Couldn't have said it better. I totally agree. And you talk about your writing, you write about personal experiences, middle school, high school. As you grew up, how would you describe these experiences, particularly in this middle school and high school setting? Because that's the time, those are your formative years where that is kind of the society's testing ground for socialization.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, it's okay. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
But I think that what's made me feel better about it is, especially with middle school, is that it's everybody's collective awkward phase. That everybody is kind of trying to figure out how to exist as a person, to get a little bit of independence from mom and dad or your parents or caregivers or whoever it may be. And I also think that it's also a formative time in that your body is changing. So a lot of people are hitting puberty for the first time. They might be developing feelings that they've never had for the first time, that people are really coming into their own in this very coming of age type way during those times. And we don't always know what to do with that information. And as autistic people, it's really scary because change is hard for any of us, and especially transitions we're either not prepared for, we don't get proper education about, or they just happen, or we feel kind of stifled while our peers are rapidly growing up. So I think that was something that mattered to me. And I really started writing about middle school, not because I thought it was something I dreamt of doing, I guess. I think what happened to me is I got into advocacy by accident, and I always like to tell the story, is I've always been raised as someone who has to give back. And I was invited by the wonderful folks at the University of Miami, who were the ones who diagnosed me. They've been with our family ever since then. I serve on their board now, full disclosure. And they invited me to the Autism Society of America conference. And I was 13. I was just done with the 8th grade to speak on a panel of self-advocates. Being raised to give back, and also because said conference was in Orlando. And when you're 13, everyone knows what Orlando means. If you need me to spell it out for you, that means you might get to go to Disney World. Of course I was going to go, because it lined up with both the fact that, I might get to go to Disney World, and also the fact that I've been raised to give back. So I'm on this panel, and on this panel, I am probably the youngest one by at least 10 years, and I'm the only girl. And somebody in the audience ends up asking me about how I found out about my diagnosis. I was not open about it in most of my life at this point, because you're 13. You don't want your friends making fun of you, and you don't have the advocacy skills to really explain everything the way that you would like to. Is sometimes the only thing I knew how to explain is some things that are common sense for you are not common sense for me. And sometimes that was the most appropriate answer that I would have at 13. So I'm explaining about Harry Potter like we did today, maybe just a little bit, less fleshed out, because when you're 13 and you're on the spot and it's the first time you've ever been asked about things, it's a little bit scary. But that story resonated with the audience, and I actually got in touch with folks from Autism Asperger Publishing Company, and 2 or 3 years later, we had a book about middle school, because everyone wanted to know what it's like to be a teenage autistic girl, because it's an experience we don't really hear from. We don't know what it's like to go through that collective awkward phase everyone has when you're autistic and you're female and your body changes, and it's like, oh my gosh, what about when you might get your first period? What about like the advent of the internet? Because social media was very much taking off, especially amongst young people at that time. I got in trouble for having a Facebook account or registering for Facebook without my parents' permission, even though I was 13. So I know under children's online privacy, I could have done it, but house rules always come first. So even just that sphere, people weren't really thinking about that impact on autistic youth, and getting to write about it was so powerful, because I was still seen as one of them as a freshman or sophomore in high school. By the time the book came out, I was a sophomore, and it just really meant a lot, because I was like, you know what, I am not super open about my autism, like publicly. I mean, I was outed by a teacher my freshman year of high school because I was doing an art show and I had proceeds going to a charity that benefited autistic people. And I was asked why. And of course, I don't know how to lie very well, so I basically told everybody. So I was basically outed in that. And with the book, I was like, you know what, if I can help one person, and my story or any advice that I have can help somebody else who went through this collective awkward phase, and after going to 3 schools in 3 years, I probably have more than enough to share. if anything I say helped somebody, then sharing was worth my time. It was worth the effort, and it was worth putting myself out there. And honestly, I could say that I've done that, and I still feel that same way about the work that I do today.
You touch upon intersectionality multiple times. And it's still, even now, we have research showing that boys are diagnosed 4 times greater than girls are. Mm-hmm. There's a disparity in diagnoses. I've anecdotally talked to a lot of adult women on the spectrum who've told me that they've been constantly misdiagnosed before they're able to really find their true diagnosis. It seems that even now, society is still not ready to believe that autistic women exist in mass. In mass, at least, like more than we think. So with this in mind, what do people regularly misunderstand about you that you personally experience, if that has happened?
Oh my gosh, we could be here all day unpacking things that people misunderstand. I think people misunderstand that I'm very extroverted. They think that I am because I also have a lot of coping skills. I know how to mask. I have masked, whether it's because of necessity, social acceptance, or personal safety. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot in the autism conversation, especially about masking or basically hiding certain traits or putting on a persona that appears more neurotypical sometimes, is that a lot of us, especially who are marginalized in some other way, will do it because of safety concerns. Is that we don't want to be subject to sexual harassment. We don't want to be subject to looking or acting suspicious in a way that might get crisis care involved or that might get law enforcement involved, because we all know that a lot of those situations do not go very well for disabled people or autistic people more specifically. So I think we have to understand that a lot of these skills, that when you think that women don't look autistic, quote, quote, that it's a lot of different reasons. And also, I think a lot of us pass in some extent because we think, okay, women who are socialized a certain way or look a certain way, that you don't appear autistic, you're not loud, you're not this 8-year-old flapping white boy that is disruptive or that is very much obsessed with trains, that you don't fit this stereotype that we've all been sold essentially about autism. We've been sold on a stereotype, and we see it in a lot of our media, and we see that same 8-year-old flapping boy as a teenager in certain media, and then we see him as a savant type adult who just struggles to socialize. Think in lines of things like The Good Doctor, think in line with things like NBC's Parenthood, where you see this kid grow up, and think about even more apparently coded characters like Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory. As we see this very specific version of autism, it's not usually a girl or a woman, and it's certainly not a person of color. So we have a very different view of autism. So people think, oh, of course that person can't be. And I always think it's really interesting now, given the most famous autistic person in the world currently is an autistic teenager. And well, she's 18 now, so I can't say she's necessarily like a teenage girl the same way that I used to, but Greta Thunberg. And I think having Greta really changed things for autistic women and girls, especially because when all of a sudden the most famous autistic person that you know of is a young woman, it's powerful stuff. So I think it's really that we have this very gendered view of autism to begin with, even how criteria is written in the DSM, if we want to go all the way back, if we want to try to understand why apparently women may act a certain way, or why there's more sophisticated levels of masking or even different survival skills and issues that men don't face. And even that, especially I think with women, that if we quote unquote look a certain way, we avoid the worst of things. And also a lot of the personality traits, I think in this very gendered way, will get viewed as quirky and cute. And I think that's something that's been said a lot about myself, and also things that have been said about a lot of my autistic women friends, is that you kind of come off like this quirky sitcom character that Zooey Deschanel might play. Is they're lovable, they're kind of strange, but you still like them, and they're cute and they're funny, and you don't think, oh, that girl's definitely autistic, even though watching some of those shows, I think, yeah, there's no way that girl is neurotypical at the very least sometimes, but who am I to say? Because it might not be explicitly written that way, but sometimes it sure appears it. So I guess that's kind of some of my ramblings on how autistic women get missed or what people really misunderstand about me. And I think that idea that I'm seen as this very extroverted person always feels very strange. Even like, is that masking, or the fact that you met me in this specific context and you got me to basically info dump on you and talk about something I really, really get excited about? Because if you get me to talk about something I'm really, really excited about, I will talk your ear off about it. If it's one-on-one, I will talk that much more. If I am in a small group of 5 people, I might say 3 words the entire time.
Yeah.
And if it's in a loud and crowded place, good luck. So I think our perception and situational is so interesting.
It's interesting that you, especially the way you rounded that up at the end, it reminds me actually of my son, but through a different lens, because he's a little black boy. And I've had people approach me and ask me, are you sure he has autism? I said, yeah, girl, I got the medical reports to prove it. It through that lens as well. And I think it's because society still, even though we're getting slightly better, it's still a lot of autism seen through that particular original lens of the white male hand clapping. And even a boy, like people forget that autistic people grow up. I don't know why that.
It's true, because I think we have this view of developmental disabilities more broadly as things that happen in childhood, because that's when most people are developing. And a lot of research is very much focused on children, cure, and cause, which doesn't always make sense, especially because we grow up and we spend the majority of our lives as adults. If you look at this very pragmatic, we're children for 18 years? And the average life expectancy is somewhere in our 70s. We spend a lot of time as adults. And there's very little research and funding and priority really given to autistic adults. It's baffling to me, especially when you just break it down very logically. Like, well, I don't know. Assuming I make it to the average age that somebody lives in this country, I will be an autistic adult for 60 years. And you spend more time caring as researchers and grant funding, et cetera, on the first 18 years of my life, when there's another 60 that you should be thinking about, because chances are I will be alive for, God willing, for a good portion of that. Maybe longer, maybe shorter. Nobody really knows how much time we get. And I don't want to get all super philosophical about that either. And we don't think about things that really affect adults, like even mental health. And we don't think about, what if we become parents? That's the one thing I would love to see research on, is autistic parents. And it's so frustrating to see everything's well, there might be this connection in childhood. It might be this, it might be that. And also we learn something else about little kids, and it's okay, that's great. But also these little kids are going to grow up. The cohort that I was in with the 90s were adults now. There are adults that were born after the millennium.
That's a great segue to law school. As an adult, you made a decision to go to law school. Why?
I was not someone who thought that they were ever going to be a lawyer. Let me just throw that out there, because personality-wise, I think lawyers were always this very specific stereotype, especially growing up, is that lawyers are people who fought with people, that they joined speech and debate. They loved politics. They loved government. They loved all of these things. They were very outgoing, very talkative, and that wasn't me. I did drama for a short period of time. I was a writer. I was very shy in school. I didn't make a lot of friends, and I hate confrontation and conflict. The best class I took in law school was mediation. You can only imagine why. So when it came time to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I think I was in my freshman year of college, and I really wanted to be a psychiatrist. I thought being a doctor, and an autistic doctor at that, would be the coolest thing in the world. Enter first semester chemistry. We were in a very complicated relationship for about 6 weeks before I dropped the class. And then I realized, as a psych major, because I wanted to stay a psych major, because as someone who does not understand people naturally, I thought understanding the human brain would be a very wonderful way to try to understand people. And I still don't 100% understand people. So I guess my plan was well-intentioned, and I know a lot of interesting, weird neuroscience things and how people think sometimes, but I don't always understand them. And I realized back at the drawing board, I had to do something that I actually liked. And I like to talk somehow. And I really like to write. And even kind of going back to that first autism conference that I went to, is I knew that anything that I did had to give back and help other people. And somehow it dawned on me that lawyers can actually do all those things. We know that a lot of lawyers do not always give back, that they enter this profession and law school for very selfish reasons. Mostly the allure of a glamorous job that pays incredibly well. We know that's why a lot of people go to law school. I did not know what I wanted to do with a law degree. I just knew that somehow this would be able to help people. And I entered law school right after my 21st birthday. So I really did not know. I didn't know any lawyers. I had a very rosy view of law school and the profession from not knowing. Most of my context of law school was Legally Blonde. And I love Legally Blonde, but as we know, it's not exactly very true to law school.
No.
In some ways it is, in most ways it's not. And I still appreciate the fantasy of law school that they give. And also realizing they incorrectly quoted the case law about subject matter jurisdiction always makes me laugh at this point in my career. See, that's the problem. Like, everything is ruined when you become an attorney. And I thought originally I was going to be a disability rights lawyer. I thought maybe I would go work for the Department of Justice or something. I just didn't know. And I knew that I was going to give back no matter what I did. And when I did go to law school, I think I really learned how to be a better self-advocate and advocate for others. I don't think law school was ever the wrong decision per se. I think that law school was something that I got a lot out of. I think I would have appreciated it more in the moment if I was a little bit older and had work experience before getting there. And I think a lot of people say that about law school. But going into law school when you're 21 and have no like significant, I've had another career, I've had another job, I Teach for America, or I taught English in another country for a year or two, or I did something else completely. I think you have a very different view on it. I think you're a little bit more idealistic. And part of you thinks that you're in school and you're just going to learn something. And then you're like, wow, lawyers do cool stuff. And then you don't really know what lawyers do until you get out. Yeah. Because student lawyering and other things are very different. And I know a lot of the situations that I put myself in during law school, I tried to do things that I enjoyed and played to my strengths. I was still scared to get out of that comfort zone. I purposely joined the group that did ethics CLEs. I thought following rules was cool. That's something that was very comforting to me, of course, as an autistic person. And I love to give presentations. So I'm like, I got to teach ethics. I got to teach legal ethics. I got to know all sorts of stuff, like if you can stalk jurors on social media and actually teach lawyers about it. And I liked it because when you present, lawyers talk to you. And as someone who networking is very uncomfortable and very much a sensory thing, it is very much a masking situation. Having lawyers come up to me to talk to me was a lot better than the reverse. So I purposely would kind of customize that law school experience in a way that benefited my neurology. I even did law review instead of moot court in journal because I was like, I don't feel comfortable with this 3-panel judges asking me a bunch of questions that no matter how prepared, I don't know if I can articulate it that quickly or not knowing what to expect. It's very different than a one-on-one conversation like this, of having an argument fully fleshed out and knowing what was written in the brief, hands down, 100%. It's just a very intimidating feeling. So I'm like, okay, that might not be for me. But writing and researching something I find really interesting, and then editing other people's work, that is extremely for me. I like to write. I like to research. I can do that. So it's really kind of that there really is somewhere for you if you're willing to find it and find your people. And sometimes I think for autistic law students as well, is that it's just very frustrating because there aren't always supports in place, and academia more broadly just doesn't understand and doesn't recognize the many ways that it fails disabled students.
Now that you've been out of school a couple of years, could you talk about some of the supports you think would have been helpful in your growth, both in law school and maybe you're still kind of in the baby lawyer phase. You've been 3 years out, but let's say that first year or two out, what often more senior lawyers call that baby lawyer phase.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So what supports do you think would have been in place that would have helped you better in your journey?
In law school, I think the misnomer that all accommodations must be extra time needs to go away. I think we just have a very jaded view of what accommodations are or should look like, and we think the answer is always extra time. I was always able to finish my work on time. And also, my law school did a lot of gatekeeping on the accommodations process, that pretty much everybody got blanket denied when I was a 1L in my first year. So I had to do a lot of self-accommodating, knowing that disability services was very hostile at my law school at first. And this is something that was a known fact, and I'm very grateful has changed since I've graduated. But it's something that looking back, I think would have made a huge difference. I also lived closer to home than I did when I was an undergrad, so I had more support from home, which was wonderful. I was able to go home every other weekend or see my parents anytime I wanted. I was only an hour away. I also think that as a baby lawyer, that having access to mentorship would have been so great, because I think that we have a lot of opportunities for mentorship and for networking and things like that, but it is very much neurotypical driven. Is that there's no real way to connect with somebody who thinks like you, is open, because there's a lot of disability stigma within the profession that is beyond frustrating, and it still hasn't gotten much better there. And also even job opportunities. So even though I was very lucky that I had an offer from my 2L summer position to join full-time afterwards, when I was looking for summer associate positions and even just seeing who might be a good fit, it was very interesting to see that in those diversity and inclusion statements or diversity summer associateships, that disability was never once part of that equation. Law has a tendency to move a little bit slow. I like to remind people that I have read many ethics opinions from the 2010s about MySpace as far as social media. So that's kind of a nice like bellwether of how slow things move in policy and things regarding lawyers in law school. So, and even like legal hiring and legal ethics, I think things move very slow and people don't realize that. Is when I was reading opinions about MySpace to inform my research, go figure. But when I was looking at 2L summer associateships, disability was never once covered in any form of diversity or anything. And it always made me feel like there was not a place for me. Even just having that, people with disabilities are encouraged to apply at the bottom that you sometimes see in certain statements, or anything other than just, I guess we can give you an accommodation if you need it. So already I was being told I am not welcomed in some way, shape, or form. And obviously there's been more of a commitment since then to encouraging that pipeline for disabled and neurodivergent lawyers and law students. So that's been things that have changed in the right direction since I've graduated. As far as once you're actually an attorney and you have a bar license, I really put more emphasis on mentorship and also being given more opportunities to grow and thrive. So as an openly autistic attorney in my early career, I was often stereotyped and pigeonholed based on what it's assumed autistic people could do. And a lot of the things that I would get were assignments related to discovery and going through litigation documents, and also document review, where you're deciding what should be produced, what's confidential, what's not, and putting it into buckets based on the issues in a case. And anytime I would bring these types of things up, somebody would always say that's very typical first-year lawyer rite of passage, cutting your teeth type work. And I would say that sounds reasonable, but I'm not the only first year in my firm. And the other first years have more substantial assignments than that. That they are giving depositions, that they are going to court more often, that they are more hands-on, being given tougher work, or at least more challenging things. And it was also very hard for me because that very technical, super hyper-focused work of going through millions of litigation documents is assumed something that I'd be good at, because I'm able to focus and all these things that we think about autistic people, and especially because a lot of it was electronic and computers, and you kind of can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And it was really frustrating, especially because the things that I was actually better at were not in tech. I was not a tech person. I did not major in computer science. I still went to law school despite being autistic. And I was a better researcher and writer. Whenever I got assigned a research assignment, it was so thorough. It was something I really enjoyed, and I had a lot more fun. And I wish that sometimes I had that real aligning to strength and wasn't just being kind of stereotyped at times in my early career. And I think mentorship is something that's so key, because a lot of folks in disability inclusion more broadly think that just giving us a job is enough. But really, we want careers. We want to be able to grow. That once you check off your little diversity checkbox and you hire somebody, you're just getting started. You are not done because you say, look, we hired neurodivergent disabled people. No, you are just beginning that journey. Congratulations. You want to mentor that person. You want to give them opportunities to grow. You want to develop them into the best professional that they could be. So that's kind of been a struggle. And I think even now that I'm no longer in practice right now, I mean, I'm sure that can change at any point in my life, but I think I've gotten more mentoring, oddly enough, not being in that situation. It's really interesting to see, I think, of how we treat other lawyers.
That can definitely be its own podcast episode. As a Black neurotypical woman, that could definitely be its own podcast episode.
About how people treat you and perceive you in this profession. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that there's so much to unpack about how the legal profession really is so conservative and so stuffed shirts that basically if you are not just like an old white guy, you don't get very far, or you don't get as far as you should and deserve to get.
The more you talked about your journey so far, I kept thinking about disclosing on your own. In some circles, they call it self-IDing, right? So what is your take on self-IDing based on what you've been through, and what would you advise of others? Because some people have very different perspectives. Some people are like, self-ID right away, let them know, so you have the proper accommodations you can get from the onset. What's your take on self-ID?
My take is that this is extremely individual, so there's no right answer. The right answer, of course, legally is ID when you need an accommodation, so then you can actually get it. But that is not a one-size-fits-all approach either. Some people want you to know up front because it might explain a gap in work history. It might explain work you've actually done, or you might soft disclose with that, because even on my resume, you'll see that I volunteered at like a nonprofit or something that's autism related. That might be a form of self-ID. There's so many different ways to disclose, and how you do it and who you do it to is so situational. So the way that I disclose to someone who might be interviewing me for a job is very different than I would to a manager that I already have, or a supervising partner or managing partner, whichever person in a firm or legal supervisor that might be. It's also very different than the way I would talk about autism with my friends, and is extremely different than the way that I would hypothetically disclose on a first date. Is I always make that clear, is it's so situational and it's so person to person. There is no one size fits all approach. And if you choose not to disclose for any reason, whether you're afraid of being discriminated against, maybe you're just nervous, maybe you just don't have the right words to say or why you're disclosing other than you think someone should know, or maybe you need an accommodation and just haven't figured out the best way to go about that, your experience is valid and you're not wrong for not disclosing or choosing to disclose in a moment. It's all about kind of weighing that pro and con, how you feel about it, and if it makes you feel safer. Some people I know disclose right away because they think that any place that doesn't accept them for who they are right away will never accept them, period. And they would rather know that something's a bad fit right away. Other people will wait until they get in the door because they don't want to be biased against, or they don't want to be seen as different right away. I don't think anybody is right or wrong in these situations. I think it's truly 100% individual. I do not get a choice because of the nature of my work, that I have been very open for most of my life. I am very outspoken. You Google me and it's the first thing you find out, whether or not I actually tell you about it. So I don't really get the luxury of kind of, do I not self-ID? And that's a conscious choice that I've made as a young person, and I live with those consequences and also benefits from it. So sometimes I'll meet people who will say, connect with me on that because they have autistic children. I've met many people that are in our profession that immediately want to talk to me because of that. And I've met people who I have to explain away all of their doubts because they see what I can't do versus what I can. So I think if you do disclose, you really have to be confident enough in your ability as a self-advocate to be able to answer any questions, any doubts, any funny looks, and be able to emotionally stomach it, because sometimes it is hard when you see somebody's ableism really showing. It's even harder when it's somebody you care about and you love. It's a lot harder. It's hard enough seeing it with somebody that you might be interviewing with for a job. It's harder if you see it with somebody you care about.
You really help to encapsulate just multiple sides of the self-IDing, how can I put it, considerations that have to be made, quite frankly. And that's what kind of goes with
it's a horrible balancing act.
Yeah.
It's a calculus that never stops.
Particularly having a hidden disability.
It's a lot harder. It's hard. Exactly. And it's a lot harder with people you actually care about, because then you have to make this like mental decision of, do I want to be a person today, or do I want to be an advocate today? Do I want to just laugh with my friends about whatever, or they'll say something that's dismissive that you don't want and you don't know, do I call them out? Do we have this conversation? Or do I just brush it off and be a person? And I think about this a lot because I had a friend who once said to me, I don't see your disability. And I think about this a lot, actually. And this happened a couple of months ago. And in that conversation, I had a choice. Do I say why that is bad? And please don't say that because it invalidates my experience, my culture, the things that I struggle with. There are so many things to unpack that's wrong with I don't see your disability. Or do I just let it go because this is someone I care about? This is my friend. I'm afraid of hurting their feelings. I'm afraid of making them feel uncomfortable having any conversations about my disability for the rest of our friendship. What do I do in this moment? Am I a person or am I an advocate? Wow. And you get maybe less than 30 seconds to make a decision. And in that moment, I said nothing. I didn't know what to do. And I realized it impacted the rest of our friendship because I did not feel comfortable opening up about certain disability topics or my life experience. And it definitely showed. And I was scared in that moment to say to my friend, hey, this is wrong. Hey, this is not something you should say. And here's why that hurts me, is I didn't feel comfortable in that moment. And I think that's something that we have to weigh is even in our personal relationships, the way that we self-ID matters, if we even choose to do it. And I know that sometimes, and with people that I'm a lot more comfortable with and have been around longer, I would have been like, you just invalidated my entire life experience. And we would have had a discussion about it. But this person in particular, I chose not to do that. And looking back, I realized that was probably the wrong decision for me, especially realizing there was a consequence that I faced, not that this person faced for saying something and not realizing that they made a mistake, but I faced in the fact that it impacted the way that I trusted them. So I think when we talk about self-ID, especially in non-professional situations, we don't realize the impact that it has on us.
It has a cumulative effect over time, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, yes, they're defined as microaggressions.
Mm-hmm.
I've experienced somewhat similar, being in the skin I'm in, literally, but it's the cumulative effect over time that builds and you start to really think about. Yep.
And you realize you have to act a certain way around certain people so you don't get perceived as less of a person.
Yeah.
Is that you have to come off that you don't have presumed competence in certain ways. And it's compounded by many different things, whether it's ableism, sexism, racism, classism, and xenophobia, whatever it may be. You might have a compounding of all of these different isms and ways that we are oppressed and marginalized. And it makes it very hard to exist in the brains and bodies that we have. And we have to weigh all of this when dealing with certain people, and especially people who will never understand it. And sometimes I think with having invisible marginalization, you are in the ugly position of, do I at least pass in some way, shape, or form if I'm able to pass? Or do I out myself and subject myself to this BS quite simply? And I think about that not just with my disability, but other forms of marginalization as well. And it's really kind of awkward to see. And it's horrible to have to think about.
And you definitely see it the more life experience you have. You see other members of your same group attempting to pass or choosing not to say something in the moment just for sometimes it's just for safety
I think that's
in
part
that
of it.
moment. It's safety in that moment.
I think I've done that a lot with I'm also Jewish, so I've done that a lot because of anti-Semitism, and I know that I don't have a Jewish sounding name, so I've done that a lot too. Like, it's interesting to think about how all these things play together. And very recently I wrote my first piece about Jewish experiences and like this idea of how people will befriend people with disabilities for bar and bat mitzvah, like service and clout basically. And it just really doesn't sit well with me because our culture and religious background really has this onus and really this big focus on doing good deeds for other people, that's doing mitzvahs. And at the same time, I don't want to be somebody's mitzvah. And it's a really awkward dance. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is also the first time I've written about any Jewish experience I've had. Am I opening myself up to anti-Semitic criticism, et cetera, et cetera? Like, you really think about this because a lot of people don't assume that I am Jewish. So it's really strange to see is that people do treat you differently when they realize there's something else that they didn't know and they don't see without second guessing.
Your advocacy takes on many forms. There's, talking to people like me, there's writing. Your recent book that you published last month, Great Minds Think Differently: Neurodiversity for Lawyers and Other Professionals. It seems like you have really, your other books were great. A personal experience you've taken, basically, it sounds like an amalgamation of the personal, of the professional, and then
that's kind of my life. That's kind of my life brand of why I do what I do. Is we don't get the marriage of personal and professional.
So, what do you hope people get out of your book, and what made you write this book at this time?
What made me write it, I think, is a better place to start. So what made me want to write about neurodiversity for lawyers is there was no conversations when I was in law school. There was no conversations in my profession, in our profession for that matter, about neurodiversity. And yet, when I was in law school, anytime another student would represent somebody who had a intellectual or developmental disability in like IEP hearings or whatever it may be, because we had a children and youth law clinic on campus, and they often represented people who were multiply marginalized and often disabled children who would end up in foster care. And they would ask me all of their questions about their clients' disabilities because they didn't have disability education in law school. We never get that when we're in law school, right? We don't get taught about different types of humans, different types of communication. We get taught the law, we get taught black letter law if we're lucky. Otherwise, you just read a bunch of court cases, right? Like, it's kind of frustrating. And that was the first time I realized, okay, there's no education for lawyers when they come in. What about when you are that lawyer? What about when you are that person who is also neurodivergent and you're fitting in and trying to be part of a profession that is very much difficult to navigate with disability because it's perceived as weakness, and being perceived as weak in any way as an attorney is seen as the worst thing that could happen to you, especially if you're dealing with opposing counsel and you're a litigator. So I really wanted to unpack this, especially because so much was happening in activism and advocacy at the time. And also because I realized there was a growing interest in this topic, especially after I went viral. And I wanted to make sure that this topic was being handled properly. And what I really wanted to do when I was writing the book is I was so scared. One, I don't want this to be an autism book. Two, I hope our profession is ready for it. And three, I want it to be readable by anybody. That you should not have to be a lawyer to have access to certain information, including things about the ADA, including things about courts, including if you're even experiencing visiting a lawyer for the first time. So I really wanted to put all of these different life experiences and different experiences that neurodivergent people face in particular. So I tried to unpack what neurodiversity is, what it isn't, what happens when we work with different kinds of minds and the benefits of that, also different barriers that neurodivergent law students face. What about do we disclose at work? What does a work environment that is universally designed and accessible and inclusive really look like? What happens if we represent neurodivergent people? And also some stuff about courts and public policy, and even thinking about that, even if you are a trial lawyer, you might have a neurodiverse jury. That there are so many things we don't think about, and neurodiversity impacts every little piece of our profession. So I wanted to at least get that groundwork running. And I wanted something that anybody could walk away with, whether you are neurodivergent yourself, you are a lawyer, you are a parent or sibling or caregiver or a loved one of some sort, that I wanted, no matter who you were, to be able to walk away with some kind of understanding, maybe a little bit of empathy, something that you might not have thought about. That's really what I was hoping to accomplish, because I really don't like that anything in our profession, especially legal books, are so inaccessible if you are not a lawyer. And what I chose to do is I actually chose to interview a bunch of neurodivergent lawyers and speak to people and law students and people who are neurodivergent who had to serve on juries or who were arrested before and had to testify, or they've given a deposition for the first time, just so I can kind of get that context of, hey, this is what we've experienced. This is why the profession is hard for me, is that my supervisor thinks that billable hours are the end all be all, and I get distracted a lot because of my ADHD, and I'm seen as that I'm lazy and I don't do the work. Or they would say something like, hey, I was called in for jury duty and the sensory aspects of everything was so difficult that I almost got arrested for contempt of court because I couldn't handle the security scanners, or I didn't know how to answer the questions in voir dire. So I think we had so much to unpack, and I feel like it's still not complete, dare I say. Like, I feel like as much as I'm really thrilled about the book and what's out there, I feel like there's still so much more to keep going. And I think that makes me really excited, as neurodiversity in the law is such a emerging new thing. And I want to be part of that, especially because so often neurodivergent people are not even part of our own conversation. So getting to help lead that in our field really means a lot.
Oh yeah. And I'm fascinated by this space too, because of all that you have mentioned, but also you look at the prison population itself. There's an overrepresentation of neurodivergence there.
It's so true, though. And it shouldn't be that way either.
Right. So there's just so much to unpack and shed a light on, and I'm glad that you are doing this and you continue to do this. You not only do this through books, you do this by writing op-eds as well. I recently saw a recent Teen Vogue article that you wrote about the reframing of Britney Spears, because I think too much in pop culture, they talk about the pop culture elements of it. But I love how you really drove home the fact that, come on, society, let's view this as what this is. This is a disability issue as well. So how has being neurodivergent yourself helped you frame your legal reasoning and arguments?
I think you see things in a different way from both your life experience and also just the way that you approach problems. So I think one of the biggest things we talk about in neurodiversity at work is that you have people who have different approaches to problem solving. And I think that's no different for legal. So I guess that's kind of the simple answer there. As for things like disability rights issues in pop culture, most journalists, most critics, most people who actually write about pop culture or who consume media don't have that experience. If we look at who journalists and media makers really are, a lot of them are not disabled. They're neurotypical. They're able-bodied. They don't have that experience. And it's really interesting to see of when there's things that disabled people have been shouting about for a very long time, and then they do have a pop culture hook, what happens? So I know, at least for me, I've been talking about guardianship and conservatorship for at least a year before everything happened, because a year ago I got to join Florida's coalition to push for supported decision-making. And I've known what these issues were before that, but getting involved with our coalition to try to get guardianship reform passed is something that was relevant to me and important to me. When they asked if I'd be interested, I was like, of course I would be. I think that's something I was thinking about when it comes to something like conservatorship. Is this is also an issue that really impacts my community, and the public doesn't realize this happens a lot. And it's suddenly very bad when it happens to somebody like Britney Spears, who has millions of dollars, lots of access, lots of fans, but somehow when we talk about conservatorship and guardianship more broadly, it's somehow seen as acceptable in a way if it happens to somebody with a developmental or intellectual disability, or someone who has an age-related disability like Alzheimer's or dementia. So basically what we're being told is it's very not okay that it happens to somebody who's able to work, who's someone who has lots of money and predatory family members involved, but it's definitely okay if it's our grandparents or if it's someone who has an intellectual disability who may need more support. That it's very interesting kind of seeing how these things shake out, and who is going to stand up for our community if our community doesn't even show any resistance or challenge to what we're being told. Is you can't just count on the allies to do all that work and to educate themselves. And most of the time, it's not that you don't trust them to do it. They don't know better, which means they have to learn from you.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And that's why the importance of I think this era, in part, just from what you see on social media, now that it exists in the form that it does, at least a positive angle on social media, is you see the rise of the self-advocate, and you are amongst them. And there are ways in which you definitely see the world that we may not be able to, and vice versa. And it's imperative that we choose more often than not to listen. Please listen. And I've learned just so much just following self-advocates and the way they view the world.
I learned a lot too.
I saw something on the Society of Human Resource Management site, or maybe it was a repost from someone else, but 70% of HR professionals report not having disability inclusion programs in their workplaces. Now, diversity and inclusion is this huge buzzword you've talked about before, about the invisibility of disability in a way, which is odd but true. And why do you think disability is still consistently left out of the greater D&I conversation in many instances?
I think this is twofold. One, we're afraid of disability. And two, we don't see it as real diversity. We see it, and I learned this very quickly. So we're afraid of disability even away from when we're children. Look at how we're taught whenever we see someone who has a physical disability or a limb difference or something. We're told not to stare and not to ask questions. We are already given that culture of fear because our parents don't know how to say, oh, maybe they were in an accident or they were born that way. And just normalizing this as a way of being human. It might not be appropriate to approach the person, but being told don't stare is not the answer either. And I think that's something we already have, that stigmatizing. So we're already told, okay, disability bad, don't ask, don't stare, don't tell. That's kind of something we learn from when we're little. And think about the message that we're sending to young people when we have those conversations, and especially in stigmatizing ways, or even just something like don't stare. Number two, I think we see disability very wrongly as a mental health and wellness thing, not so much diversity. And I learned this when I joined our local Women Lawyers Association, and they wanted me to co-chair a committee. And I was very happy to have an opportunity as a young lawyer to be a committee chair. And they said, we think you would be a better fit for health and wellness, and that's where disability belongs. And I had to advocate on behalf of not just me, but my community, that you could still be healthy and well and still be disabled, and that disability is in fact a diversity issue. Calling disability a mental health and wellness thing is really stigmatizing to people who have psychiatric disabilities. It's stigmatizing to people who have physical disabilities, or someone who has a chronic illness or something in the middle. Because you could be doing all you can and you might never be healthy and well if you have a chronic illness, because that's exactly what your body and immune system are doing. You might never be able to run a marathon, as so many different health and wellness committees do, as they plan like 5Ks and things like that, if you're in a wheelchair. It's not a health and wellness issue.
Yeah.
It's an ableism issue when we're lumping it into health and wellness. And I was like, actually, we are diverse. We make up a large percentage of Americans, and we're the only marginalized minority group that you can join at any point in your life if you have the privilege to live a long time. That you might end up in there by a tragic accident, or you might just have some age-related health conditions and complications that automatically make you part of the disability community. That if you, God forbid, someday get cancer, if you develop Alzheimer's or dementia, you are disabled. That disability is something that can happen to anybody, and chances are it will happen to you. Or you're in a very bad, God forbid, a million times car accident. Like, this is something that can happen to anybody. Some of us are just lucky enough to be born that way, that we already have neurodivergence. Maybe we didn't acquire PTSD from a tragic or traumatic event, or we didn't have a traumatic brain injury. We didn't have some kind of acquired neurodivergence yet. But some of us are born this way, others aren't. And we are better as a society for having differences. And I think seeing disability is kind of that ugly form of diversity, as people sometimes think of it, because they think physical disabilities are unwell, or they think it's unsightly. That seeing it as somehow even less human is really scary to me. And I think that excluding it from DEI is one of the biggest mistakes that companies make today, is they just see us as less deserving, less human, and less capable of anything that we do, because all they see is this tragic, scary, bad thing.
I want to talk to you about universal design, accessibility for all, through your lens as both a lawyer, a neurodivergent woman. What trends do you see in this space that's positive?
I think remote work has been a huge boon to the disability community, because we've always been told it's an unreasonable accommodation. That's my first kind of go-to, but yes, everything should be accessible forever. It also minimizes your legal liability, so you should like that. But most of us, but if you're not in compliance or HR, or you're not a business owner who's thinking about your liability, just think about that you can actually help people And doing universal design and curve cut effect type implementations benefits literally everybody. Chances are you watch Netflix with captions. Mm-hmm. And chances are you are not deaf or hard of hearing. Why do you watch Netflix with captions? Maybe you have difficulty paying attention. Maybe you're just better as a visual learner than an auditory learner. Maybe English is not your first language, or whatever language you're watching the movie or show in, and you're using it in order to follow along or to learn or to translate. Or maybe you just want to make sure you don't miss any words that happen. There's so many different reasons that you are probably using captions, even though it originated to help people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So keep that in mind when we think about accessibility, is look at all the benefits that you probably get from just regular accessibility features that were not designed with you in mind, but they were designed to help someone who has a lot more difficulty and different marginalization than you do. And ultimately, it lifts all of us up.
Definitely. I think that's a huge, for a lot of people, when they think of universal design, they think of only a subset of people that benefit, but I think a lot of
all of us do.
Yeah, people don't realize.
The only time I have questions with universal design is when you have conflicting access needs, when you try to make something accessible forever. And I think about that with elevators. Is that you might have buttons that have braille, you might have the voice on the loudspeaker that reads what floor you're on, or you might have a light on the thing that says what floor you're on. And you might have someone who has a huge sensory aversion to hearing the noise, or that has sensory issues with the lights, but braille doesn't help them and neither does something else. So you might have conflicting access needs coming from a universal design approach too. I'm trying to figure out how that works, but I think that you're never going to hit everybody's access needs. And I think there's a difference between comfort and accessibility, which people don't always realize.
Definitely.
But I think there has to be a way to reach the greatest amount of people and help the most amount of people. It's just, how do we help as many people as possible?
Right. Like now, another great example is just the rise of popularity in audiobooks. Because I had a good friend in law school whose dad was blind, and he would always tell me how he would bond with his dad through audiobooks a lot. And I would be like, oh, I never viewed it in that lens before. I that was at kind of at the beginning of when audiobooks started getting really popular. I said, that makes total sense, because now people use audiobooks. I mean, you don't have to have a disability to enjoy them. I mean, I go on road trips for hours and pop in a good audiobook. It's a good example of just how, if done well, you now have multiple ways in which to enjoy a product or service.
Exactly.
So, I mean, this has been a wonderful conversation. For those that don't know how to follow you, reach you, what's the best form of following your amazing developments?
You can say hello to me on social media. I am on Twitter and Facebook at Haley Moss Art. I'm also on Instagram at Haley.Moss right now, and you can visit me online at HaleyMoss.net.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please share and subscribe. If you're curious as to how this podcast came to be, please check out season 1 of this podcast on notyourmamasautism.com or on any major podcast platform. In our next episode, the last episode of the season, we speak with another self-advocate, one who is only starting to find her way in this world. See you soon.
Not Your Mama's Autism podcast is hosted and written by my mom, Lila Dada Ali, and it's also co-written and produced by me, Fella Ali. My dad, little sister Alero, and I are all occasional contributors. My dad, Tosin Ali, also helps produce sometimes. Big thanks to my aunt, Bolane Williams Ali, who did our graphic design. See you guys soon. 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 You guys soon.